The auditorium was buzzing with excitement, the air filled with the proud chatter of families and the rustling of graduation gowns. For Marion Whitmore, the day was supposed to be nothing short of perfect. Her daughter Sophie was graduating with honors, a moment Marion had dreamed of for decades. She had imagined this day since Sophie was a little girl, practicing spelling words at the kitchen table, her tongue sticking out in concentration while Marion patiently coached her. Now that same little girl stood among a sea of young adults, ready to take her next step into the world. Marion, 72, felt a lump in her throat as she clutched her program. Her life hadn't been easy, but Sophie had always been her greatest reward. She had endured years of sacrifice, long nights, and silent tears to make sure her daughter had opportunities she never did. Watching Sophie walk across that stage, cap tassels swinging with every determined step, Marion's chest swelled with pride. This, she thought, this is the proof that everything was worth it. Beside her, her husband Richard sat stiffly in his chair, adjusting his tie as though he were more concerned about his appearance than the occasion. Marion glanced at him, expecting to see the same pride reflected in his face, but instead, his eyes weren't fixed on Sophie at all. He was looking down at his phone, screen glowing faintly in the dim light of the auditorium. His fingers tapped rapidly, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. At first, Marion tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a work email, though she knew Richard had retired nearly 2 years ago. Maybe a congratulatory message from family, she reasoned. But the way he hunched over, the way he shielded the screen from her view with his hand, sent a cold, unwelcome suspicion through her veins. She followed his gaze when he finally lifted his head, her eyes tracing the line of his sight across the rows of seats. That was when she saw her. Linda, their neighbor. Dressed more elegantly than the other guests, Linda looked less like someone attending a graduation and more like someone stepping into a cocktail party. Her hair was perfectly styled, her jewelry catching the auditorium lights with deliberate sparkle. Marion noticed the way Linda shifted in her seat just slightly until her eyes found Richard's. And then it happened. A glance, brief but charged, like a spark leaping across an open flame. Richard's lips curved into the faintest smile. Linda's eyes lingered too long. Marion's stomach dropped. She gripped her program tighter, the paper crinkling under her fingers. Her heart was pounding so loudly she worried Sophie might hear it from the stage. She told herself not to make assumptions, not to leap to conclusions. Not here, not today. It was Sophie's moment, and Marion refused to let anything, even Richard's strange behavior, steal it away. But no matter how hard she tried to focus on Sophie, her eyes kept flicking back to Richard and Linda. Every time Richard's phone buzzed, he shifted uncomfortably, his thumb moving quickly over the screen. Every time Marion dared to glance at Linda, she caught her staring forward with that same practiced smile. A smile Marion had once considered friendly, neighborly, safe. The ceremony pressed on, applause echoing as each graduate's name was called. When Sophie finally walked across the stage, receiving her diploma with a radiant smile, Marion clapped so hard her palms stung. She felt tears prick her eyes, overwhelmed by pride. She wanted to freeze the moment, to bottle it up forever. But as she turned to share that pride with her husband, Richard's gaze wasn't on their daughter. It was angled slightly to the side, back toward Linda. The applause rang in Marion's ears, but all she felt was silence. Cold, heavy silence. After the ceremony, when families gathered for photos, Marion tried to shake the unease clawing at her chest. Sophie ran up to them, her face glowing, diploma in hand. "Mom! Dad, we did it!" she cried, pulling them both into a hug. Marion held on tightly, forcing a smile, pushing her suspicion into the darkest corner of her mind for just a moment. But as the camera clicked and relatives shouted instructions for one more picture, Marion caught sight of Linda again, hovering too close, smiling too warmly, laughing a little too much at Richard's jokes, as though she belonged in the frame. And when Marion glanced at Richard, she saw the truth flicker for just an instant in his eyes. A warmth he hadn't shown her in years, a secret she wasn't meant to see. That was when Marion knew. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. And though she would not confront it yet, not here, not in front of Sophie, Marion felt the first crack open in the foundation of her marriage. A quiet fracture, small but deep, the kind that promised to grow wider, louder, until it finally broke everything apart. She didn't know how bad it would get. She didn't know the humiliation that was waiting, or the betrayal that would soon rise to the surface in front of everyone they loved. But as she stood there smiling for the camera, her heart was already bracing itself for the storm. The parking lot outside the auditorium buzzed with laughter and congratulations. Families clustered in little groups, snapping photos, adjusting bouquets of flowers, and passing around balloons with Class of the Year written in glitter. For Marion, it should have been one of the happiest afternoons of her life, and yet a strange heaviness pressed down on her chest as she followed Sophie toward the car. Richard was by her side, his hand loosely brushing against her elbow, but there was no warmth in the gesture. He seemed distracted, scanning the crowd like a man waiting for someone. Marion tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself that she was simply imagining things, until she noticed Linda again. The IUA neighbor was leaning against her car a few spaces away, her laugh drifting across the lot like a melody too sweet to be sincere. She wasn't alone. Her teenage son lingered nearby, looking mortified in his too tight suit. But Linda's eyes weren't on her son. They were on Richard. Marion stiffened. She'd known Linda for years. They had shared recipes, gossiped about the neighborhood association, even helped each other shovel snow in the long winters. She remembered the afternoon Linda had cried on her porch about her marriage falling apart, how Marion had comforted her with tea and sympathy. She had thought of Linda as a friend, someone safe, but the way Linda tilted her head now, her smile widening when Richard glanced her way, made Marion's stomach turn. Sophie broke through Marion's thoughts, her voice bubbling with excitement. "Mom, let's take more pictures before we go to dinner. I want to get some with you and Dad together." Marion forced a smile and nodded, wrapping an arm tightly around her daughter's waist. She clung to Sophie as though holding on to her could keep the cracks from spreading wider. Cameras flashed, friends congratulated them, and Marion did her best to focus on the moment. But while Sophie posed with classmates, Marion's eyes drifted back toward Richard. He had slipped away, phone pressed to his ear. His expression was relaxed, almost smug, as though whatever conversation he was having was more enjoyable than celebrating his daughter's achievements. Marion's chest tightened. She moved a few steps closer, pretending to adjust Sophie's gown so she could overhear. Richard's voice was low, but she caught fragments. "Yes, tonight. Proud of her, of course. Can't wait to see you." He chuckled, the kind of soft laugh he hadn't used with her in years. Her heart skipped. Who was on the other end of that call? The answer seemed obvious, but Marion shook her head, refusing to let the thought take full form. It was easier to cling to denial than face the betrayal rising like bile in her throat. Dinner was held at a cozy restaurant downtown, the kind of place Marion had booked months in advance because she wanted Sophie to feel celebrated. The table was set with candles and crisp linens, the air rich with the smell of roasted meats and fresh bread. Marion should have been savoring every moment, but her mind was miles away. Throughout the meal, Richard kept slipping outside. Each time he excused himself with a vague, "Just need to make a quick call." Each time, Marion's fork grew heavier in her hand. Sophie noticed too, frowning slightly, but Marion gave her a reassuring squeeze under the table. When Richard disappeared for the third time, Marion could no longer sit still. She rose quietly, slipping past the waiter carrying a tray of desserts, and stepped into the parking lot. The air outside was cool, tinged with the scent of rain. Marion spotted him instantly. Richard wasn't. Alone. By the far corner of the lot, just beyond the glow of the restaurant's lanterns, he stood with Linda. Their heads were bent close together, their laughter muffled but unmistakable. Richard reached out, brushing a stray curl from Linda's shoulder, as though the gesture were natural, practiced. Marion froze, the world tilting beneath her feet. Her worst suspicion had been confirmed in a single stolen moment. She wanted to scream, to march across the pavement and tear them apart. But something stronger held her back. Sophie. Her daughter was still inside, savoring what should be one of the happiest days of her life. Marion would not ruin it. Not tonight. So she turned away, her nails digging into her palms, forcing herself to swallow the humiliation. Her heart was splintering, but her face remained composed when she re-entered the restaurant. Sophie beamed when Marion returned to the table. "Where's Dad?" she asked innocently. Marion pressed a smile onto her lips, her throat tight. "He'll be along in a moment," she said softly. And in that instant, Marion made a decision. She would not confront Richard in whispers and shadows. She would not beg or plead for scraps of truth. If he was betraying her, and the neighbor she had once called a friend, then she would expose him in a way he could never deny. For now she would wait. But the seed of resolve had been planted. The days following Sophie's graduation should have been filled with joy. Phone calls from relatives, framed photos on the mantle, the quiet satisfaction of a milestone reached. But for Marion, the sweetness was tainted. Each time she glanced at the smiling photographs of her daughter in cap and gown, she remembered the shadows in the parking lot. Richard leaning in too close to Linda, their laughter spilling into the night like a secret she was never meant to hear. Richard's excuses multiplied in the weeks that followed. He claimed he had errands, that old colleagues wanted to catch up, that he was volunteering for projects Marion had never heard of before. His phone, once left casually on the kitchen counter, was now glued to his hand. He angled the screen away from her when messages buzzed. Sometimes late at night, Marion woke to the faint glow of the screen in their darkened bedroom. His face lit with a smile he hadn't shown her in years. Marion told herself she needed proof. Not just suspicion, not just shadows and whispers. Proof. Because when the time came, she wanted to look him in the eye and know she had seen the truth with her own hands. One evening while Richard showered, Marion's trembling fingers picked up his phone from the nightstand. Her heart pounded so violently she thought it might crack her ribs. She tapped the screen, and the messages bloomed open like a wound. Linda's name was at the top. Her eyes darted across the words, "Last night was perfect. Can't believe we pulled it off during the graduation. You looked so handsome. I'll leave the side light on for you." There were hearts, kisses, strings of emojis that felt childish and cruel in their intimacy. Marion dropped the phone onto the bed, covering her mouth with her hand to stifle the sob clawing its way up her throat. The betrayal wasn't just real, it was flaunted. Her husband of nearly 50 years had not only broken his vows, he had done it with the woman who lived 3 doors down. The woman who had once cried on Marion's porch and called her a friend. Memories crashed into her like waves. Years of cooking dinners Richard barely acknowledged, of folding his shirts with crisp precision, of standing by his side through every disappointment. She remembered the nights she sat up with Sophie through fevers while Richard worked late, the holidays she planned, the birthdays she stretched their budget to make special. She had carried the weight of their family through storms and sickness, always believing Richard was her partner. And here he was, throwing it all away for stolen moments with a neighbor. Marion curled into herself, clutching the blanket to her chest, her tears soaking the fabric. She wanted to scream, to wake him, to demand an explanation. But when she heard the bathroom door creak open, the steam rolling into the bedroom, she shut her eyes and pretended to be asleep. Richard slid into bed, humming softly under his breath, his phone tucked safely under the pillow. Marion lay still, every muscle rigid, her chest burning with the effort to keep quiet. She had seen enough to know, but not enough to act. Not yet. The next morning she confided in Evelyn, her closest friend. They sat at the kitchen table, mugs of coffee cooling between them, Marion's voice trembling as she recounted the messages. Evelyn reached across the table, squeezing Marion's hand firmly. "You can't just throw this at him without being ready," Evelyn warned. "Men like Richard, they'll twist things. He'll say you misunderstood, that you're imagining it. If you're going to expose him, it has to be undeniable. No way out." Marion nodded, though her heart ached. She hated the thought of becoming a detective in her own marriage. But she knew Evelyn was right. So she began to watch. She noted the times Richard left the house, the excuses he gave, the clothes he wore. She paid attention to Linda's schedule, noticing how her car often disappeared from the driveway at the same time Richard's did. She even called the neighbor across the street one afternoon, under the guise of checking on neighborhood watch schedules and learned Linda's husband had filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. The timing matched perfectly. The puzzle pieces slid into place with sickening clarity. Each new detail was a dagger, but it also hardened Marion's resolve. She would not whisper accusations behind closed doors. She would not give Richard the chance to paint her as jealous or senile. No, if she was going to confront him, it would be on a stage where denial was impossible. And in the quiet hours of the night, as Richard texted under the covers, Marion began to plan. Marion had always believed herself to be a patient woman. Patience had carried her through sleepless nights with Sophie, through lean years when every dollar mattered, through Richard's bouts of pride and stubborn silence. But patience now was no longer a virtue. It was a weapon. She moved through the house with deliberate calm, her grief tucked away behind a mask of normalcy. Richard hardly noticed the change. If anything, her silence made things easier for him. He left earlier in the mornings, returned later at night, his excuses predictable and tired. Old friend from work. Errand in town. Linda needs help fixing her porch steps. That last one had made Marion choke back a bitter laugh. But instead of confronting him, she began to document. She bought a small notebook, pale blue with roses on the cover, and slid it into the drawer of her nightstand. Each time Richard left, she recorded the hour. When his car disappeared down the block, she watched Linda's driveway. More often than not, her car vanished within minutes of his. Marion's neat handwriting filled the pages with damning patterns. Dates, times, places. Evelyn, ever the practical friend, coached her gently. Don't just rely on what you see. Get something he can't argue against. So Marion became resourceful. She found the courage to scroll further through Richard's messages one morning while he showered. She took photos of the screen with her own phone, her hands trembling but steady enough to capture them all. The late-night "I miss you" notes, the blurry selfies of Richard smiling in Linda's living room, the declarations of love that cut through Marion's chest like glass. Each click of the camera was another piece of her armor. It wasn't enough to know. She needed the kind of proof that would silence Richard's excuses forever. And as she pieced together her evidence, a plan began to take shape. The graduation party. Sophie had been dreaming of it for months, a celebration in their backyard, surrounded by family, neighbors, and friends. The decorations were already boxed in the garage. Banners, fairy lights, a cake stand. Sophie wanted a joyful send-off before leaving for graduate school. Richard, oblivious to Marion's discovery, had been enthusiastic about the party. He even suggested inviting Linda, which nearly made Marion laugh out loud. The arrogance of it. He thought he could parade his mistress into their own home under the guise of neighborly friendliness, never imagining Marion might see through him. Marion decided then this would be the place. Not in whispers, not behind closed doors, not where he could deny or deflect, but in the heart of their community, in front of their daughter, their neighbors, their friends. The Yeri, same people he had deceived would become his witnesses. It was a cruel thought, to expose him at a celebration. But Marion's heart had hardened. She thought of all the nights she had lain awake beside him, listening to his soft chuckles as he texted another woman. She thought of Linda's smug smile at the ceremony, her boldness in meeting Richard outside the restaurant as though Marion were invisible. They would not get away with it quietly. Evelyn agreed to help. Together they assembled a folder, printed screenshots of messages, photographs of Richard sneaking into Linda's yard, even the divorce records Evelyn had pulled from public court filings. Marion tucked the folder into a manila envelope, sealed it, and placed it under the stack of graduation decorations in the garage. Are you sure you want to do it this way? Evelyn asked one afternoon as they strung fairy lights along the porch. Marion's eyes, once soft and forgiving, gleamed with steel. If I confront him alone, he'll make me out to be the villain. He'll twist it until Sophie pities him. But if I do this where everyone sees, the truth will stand on its own. The night before the party, Marion stood in the backyard, staring at the empty tables, the twinkling lights waiting to glow. She imagined the scene that would unfold. Sophie glowing with happiness, Richard basking in false pride, Linda hovering like a vulture. And then the silence that would fall when she revealed everything. Her hands trembled as she clasped them together, but not with fear, with resolve. Marion had spent a lifetime being quiet, accommodating, forgiving. Tomorrow she would not be quiet. Tomorrow she would not bend. Tomorrow Richard would face the truth. The afternoon sun bathed the Whitmore backyard in gold, filtering through the maple trees and glinting off the fairy lights Marion had carefully strung the night before. The yard looked beautiful. Tables draped in crisp linens, centerpieces of fresh flowers, a cake topped with "Congratulations, Sophie" in looping script. It was everything Marion had envisioned for her daughter's graduation celebration, the kind of memory Sophie could treasure before moving on to graduate school. Guests began arriving in cheerful waves, their arms full of gifts and cards. Relatives hugged Sophie, neighbors congratulated her, and friends snapped selfies against the decorated backdrop. Laughter carried across the yard, mingling with the clinking of glasses and the smell of roasted meats from the buffet. Marion moved gracefully among them, smiling, refilling cups, checking that everything was perfect. Outwardly, she was the proud mother, hosting with warmth and care. Inwardly, her pulse thundered. She knew what was coming. Tonight wasn't just Sophie's night. It was Richard's reckoning. Richard was in his element, laughing loudly, shaking hands, slapping shoulders as though he were the proud patriarch at the center of it all. He rear high, looked every inch the devoted father, beaming whenever someone congratulated Sophie. Only Marion, watching him with careful eyes, could see the subtle flicker of impatience whenever his phone buzzed in his pocket. And then Linda arrived. She swept into the backyard in a dress that shimmered in the evening light, her makeup flawless, her perfume drifting on the summer breeze. She carried a small gift bag and a smile just a little too wide. Marion saw the way Richard's eyes lit up, the way his posture shifted, shoulders back, chin high. Sophie, sweet and unsuspecting, rushed forward to hug her. "Mrs. Dawson, you came!" Sophie exclaimed, her voice full of genuine gratitude. "Of course, dear," Linda replied smoothly. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." Marion forced a polite smile, greeting Linda with the cool detachment of someone shaking hands with an enemy under truce. She noted the way Linda's gaze lingered on Richard, the subtle curl of her lips, as though the two shared a secret joke no one else in the world could hear. Evelyn caught Marion's eye across the yard, her expression steady, reassuring. She clutched a slim folder in her purse, ready for the moment Marion would give the signal. The party carried on. Guests laughed, Sophie opened gifts, children darted across the lawn chasing bubbles. Yet beneath the cheer, Marion felt tension coil tighter and tighter, like a spring ready to snap. She watched Richard hover near Linda whenever he thought no one was looking. Once she caught him leaning in close, whispering something that made Linda laugh softly, her hand brushing his arm. The sight made Marion's stomach twist, but she remained silent. She wanted it to build. She wanted the truth to land with maximum weight. As dusk settled, lanterns and fairy lights bathed the yard in a warm glow. The time came for Sophie's thank you speech. She stood on the small wooden deck, glass in hand, her voice trembling with joy. "I just want to thank everyone who believed in me," Sophie said, her eyes shining. "Mom, Dad, you've given me everything. I wouldn't be here without you." Applause rippled across the crowd. Richard beamed, clapping the loudest, pride radiating off him. Marion felt her throat tighten at her daughter's words. Yes, Sophie had thanked her father, the man who had betrayed them both in the worst way. When Sophie finished, she raised her glass high, her smile radiant. "To family," she declared. Glasses clinked, laughter rang out, and for a moment the party was everything it should have been. And then Marion rose from her chair. Her hands did not shake. Her voice, when it came, was calm but carried across the yard like a bell. "I'd like to say a few words too," she began, stepping onto the deck beside her daughter. The guests hushed, turning toward her with polite smiles, expecting a mother's proud tribute. Richard's grin faltered just slightly. Linda's eyes narrowed. Evelyn's hand slipped into her purse. Marion's gaze swept the crowd, lingering on her daughter's glowing face. before settling on her husband. Graduations are about endings and beginnings, Marion said softly. Today, one chapter ends for Sophie, but another ends for me too. And I think it's time you all knew why. The yard fell silent. Only the hum of the lanterns filled the air. Richard shifted in his chair, his hand tightening around his glass. Linda's smile froze, brittle. The stage was set. Tomorrow Sophie would remember her graduation, but tonight everyone would remember the night Marion ended the charade. The fairy lights twinkled against the darkness as Marion stood on the wooden deck, her frame small but steady, her voice steady as it carried over the backyard. Dozens of faces turned toward her, some expectant, some confused. Sophie smiled up at her mother, waiting for what she assumed would be heartfelt words. Richard leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg casually, masking the unease twitching at the corners of his mouth. Marion's gaze lingered on her daughter for a moment. "Sophie," she began, her voice warm, "you are the light of my life. Everything I've done, every sacrifice, every long night, it was all worth it for this moment." Applause started again, soft but encouraging. Sophie's cheeks flushed pink with pride. Richard smirked, relaxing into his chair as though the storm he feared wasn't coming after all. Then Marion's tone shifted. Her words grew sharper, her voice firm. "But graduations aren't only about beginnings, they're also about endings. And today, I think it's time one part of my life ends too. The part where I stay silent while I am betrayed in my own home." The crowd stilled instantly. The laughter and hum of conversation evaporated into the night air. Sophie's smile faltered, confusion flickering across her face. Richard straightened in his chair. "Marion," he began, his voice low, warning. But Marion pressed on. Her eyes, usually so gentle, were unflinching now. "For months, I've watched my husband smile at another woman. I've listened to his excuses, his lies, his laughter late at night that wasn't meant for me. And tonight, in front of the very people who know us best, I will not let him pretend any longer." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Heads turned instinctively and landed on Linda. Linda froze, her smile slipping, her hand tightening on her wine glass. Her teenage son flushed crimson, looking anywhere but at his mother. Richard's face drained of color. "Marion, that's enough. Not here. Not now." But Marion's voice rose, clear and sharp. "Yes, Richard. Here. Now, because you made your choices in whispers and shadows, but I will bring them into the light." Evelyn moved forward from the crowd, her presence a quiet anchor. She handed Marion the folder, the manila envelope now heavy with proof. Marion opened it with deliberate slowness, pulling out page after page of printed text messages. Her hands did not shake. "This," she said, holding up the first sheet so the guest closest to the deck could see, "is a message Richard sent the night of Sophie's graduation. While our daughter celebrated one of the greatest achievements of her life, he texted Linda, 'Last night was perfect. Can't wait to see you again.'" A murmur rolled through the yard. Faces turned toward Richard, then back to Linda, who was rigid in her chair, lips pressed into a hard line. Marion held up another page. "And here, leave the sidelight on for me. That's not from a husband devoted to his wife. That's from a man sneaking into another woman's house, into our neighbor's house." Gasps turned into whispers, sharp and cutting. The neighbors, once friendly, were staring at Linda with thinly veiled disgust. Sophie's face crumpled, her glass trembling in her hand. "Mom," Sophie whispered, her voice breaking. Richard shot to his feet, his face flushed now with anger. "This is ridiculous. You're humiliating yourself, Marion. You've taken things out of context." But Marion's voice cut him off like steel. "Out of context? Then perhaps you can explain these photographs." She laid down the final pieces of evidence. Snapshots Evelyn had taken discreetly. Richard stepping into Linda's driveway at night, his hand brushing hers. The glow of Linda's living room light as Richard disappeared inside. The evidence was undeniable. The silence that followed was suffocating. Richard's mouth opened and closed, searching for words that would not come. Linda's teenage son shoved his chair back, muttering, "I knew it," before storming off into the house. Linda's face collapsed, her practiced elegance melting into shame. And then Sophie's voice pierced the air, trembling but fierce. "At my graduation, Dad." "With her?" Tears filled her eyes as she stared at him, her diploma clutched in her trembling hands. "Wasn't this day supposed to be about me? About our family?" Richard reached toward her, desperate now. "Sophie, sweetheart, it wasn't like that." But Sophie stepped back, her voice breaking. "Don't you dare call me sweetheart. You don't get to stand here and pretend you're the father I thought you were." The crowd was still, their eyes fixed on the crumbling man in the center of the storm. Marion took one last step forward. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the night like a blade. "You thought you could betray me in silence. You thought you could make me invisible. But tonight, Richard, the whole world sees you for what you are." The fairy lights glowed brighter somehow against the silence that followed, illuminating the ruin of Richard's carefully constructed facade. The backyard erupted in hushed murmurs, the kind of stunned whispers that ripple through a crowd when something irreversibly shocking has been revealed. Marion stood tall, folder of evidence in her hands, her chin lifted in quiet defiance. Richard, however, looked as though the earth had been ripped from under him. Sophie's face was streaked with tears, her chest rising and falling as she tried to process what she had just heard. The girl who had been radiant minutes before was now crumbling in front of everyone. She turned on her father, her voice sharp with pain. "How could you, Dad? With her? She lives right next door." Richard stepped forward, his hands out as though reaching for his daughter could undo the damage. "Sophie, please, it's not what you think. I made a mistake, but it doesn't change how much I love you." "Stop!" Sophie snapped, her voice trembling. "Don't you dare use the word love right now. Not after you've humiliated Mom. Not after you've made me stand here like a fool, thanking you in my speech while you were sneaking around behind her back." The words cut through Richard like a blade. His shoulders sagged, his mouth working soundlessly. For years, he had prided himself on being the respected man of the neighborhood, the dependable husband and father. And now, in the space of minutes, it had all come undone. Not in private, but in front of family, friends, neighbors. Linda, sitting frozen at her table, finally stood, her face drained of its polished confidence. Her teenage son had already stormed off, and now she could feel the burning stares of every guest. This is ridiculous," she muttered, fumbling for her purse. "I don't need to sit here and be attacked." But her words only deepened the disdain in the crowd. One neighbor, a woman who had once traded recipes with her, whispered harshly, "Shameful." Another shook his head, muttering, "Disgusting." "With your friend's husband?" Linda's composure crumbled. She stumbled toward the gate, her heels clicking against the stone path. Richard made a desperate move to follow her, but Marion's voice stopped him cold. "Don't even think about it." The steel in her tone left no room for argument. Richard froze, turning back toward her with a mix of anger and desperation. "Marion, for God's sake, we can talk about this in private. You didn't have to humiliate me like this." Marion's laugh was bitter, humorless. "Humiliate you? You humiliated me the moment you chose her. You humiliated Sophie on the most important day of her life. I'm simply returning what you gave us. But I'm doing it in the open, where everyone can finally see the truth." He faltered, his pride crumbling under the weight of her words. But Marion wasn't finished. She turned to the crowd, her voice clear and unwavering. "Richard thought he could betray me and still live under my roof, spend my money, eat at my table as though nothing had changed. But what he forgot is that this house, this life, it was built on my back. My savings paid for this home. My name is on the deed. And as of last week, I've already filed the papers to remove his access to every account, every asset." A stunned silence fell. Richard's jaw dropped. You did what?" Marion's eyes gleamed, not with cruelty, but with righteous strength. "You thought you were clever, Richard, but while you were sneaking around in the dark, I was preparing in the light. You may have betrayed me as a husband, but you will not ruin me as a woman. I won't let you." The neighbors exchanged glances, some nodding in admiration, others clapping softly, hesitantly at first, then louder. It wasn't the polite applause of celebration. It was the sound of respect, of solidarity. Richard looked around, desperate, but all he saw were faces filled with disgust and judgment. His legacy, his reputation, was gone, and Marion had taken it from him with nothing more than the truth. Sophie stepped forward, her voice breaking but steady. "Mom, you didn't just protect yourself. You protected me too." She wrapped her arms around Marion, and the crowd watched as mother and daughter clung to each other in the glow of the fairy lights. Richard stood alone, his glass still in his trembling hand, watching as everything he thought he controlled slipped through his fingers. In the days that followed, the whispers spread like wildfire. The neighbors talked. The story moved from porch to porch, from one end of Maplewood Lane to the other. Richard Whitmore, once seen as the dependable family man, was now the cautionary tale, the husband who betrayed not only his wife, but his own community's trust. Linda, once welcomed into backyards and kitchens, found herself ostracized. Doors closed when she walked by. Her son avoided the neighbors' eyes at school. Richard packed a bag within days, leaving the house with nothing more than a muttered apology and the clothes on his back. Marion did not watch him go. She sat in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug of tea, staring out the window at the garden they had once planted together. She didn't need to see him walk away. She had already let him go the night of Sophie's graduation. The house felt quieter now. For the first time in years, Marion could hear herself think. There were moments of grief, yes. Betrayal, no matter how righteously confronted, still left scars. But beneath the sorrow was something stronger. Freedom.